Good afternoon, everyone. We have a new lesson today. This is going to be a good one. I'm fascinated with the story of Abraham, and out of everything, this Abraham is probably my favorite person in the Bible, and you'll understand why when we're done. So now, in this lesson, this is called the chosen people and the time of the patriarchs. So remember, after the dispersion of all the people at the Tower of Babel, okay, so the dispensation of human government ends there. It ends in failure again. Remember, I've talked about this before, that God deals with man in every dispensation, and then it ends in failure as mankind rebels against God and then refuses to acknowledge that he's the only one and true God. So 250 years go by, and now a new dispensation is about to start. And this one is going to be called the time of promises. God looks out again and he finds one man, just like he did with Noah. And this man was from Ur of the Chaldees, which Ur is located near the Persian Gulf, and it's in the area again of Iraq. And the word Chaldees means that they were a Semitic tribe. They were highly civilized. They were very wealthy, prominent city, but it was very pagan and very idolatrous. So in this lesson, you're going to learn how God singles out one man who then in turn turns into a family, and then they become a nation. And so they become a depository of truth. And what I mean by depository is that word depository means a place where things are stored, a place of safekeeping or safeguarding. So he singles out this man, this family, this nation to be a depository of truth, because Abraham believed God and he was a righteous man. And so God makes a blood covenant agreement with him, a foreshadow of a new covenant which we are enjoying today. So that foreshadow that I mean by when I say that, it means that it was like a pre-scene or a show of something that will occur in the future. So he made an agreement and a covenant with Abraham that we would be able to see in our day. So Abraham is called the father of the faithful, and God is going to give him promises. That is the reason now we enter into this new dispensation called the dispensation of promise. God will give Abraham a sign. Remember how he gave Noah the covenant sign was the rainbow. And so every time they looked up into the sky, they knew that God would not destroy the earth anymore. God made a promise to Noah that he would not destroy the earth. And so now this sign that he would be making with Abraham would be a sign of circumcision. This new covenant of the future after Jesus' death would include not only the Jews, but also the entire world. And God designed the Hebrew nation to be like a safety deposit box, that vault of safekeeping for his word, for his holy oracles, and also an understanding that there was only one God. So he was using this nation of Israel as that safekeeping, that vault of truth for the world, And the Hebrew nation would provide a channel through where the Redeemer, Jesus Christ, would come to earth. And through Christ, God's blessing would flow to all the world. Also, Israel would be appointed to witness to all the nations of the world about the beautiful life that God had intended for them. Israel was to amplify the ideal nation of a happy people, a healthy people, a prosperous, peaceful. And God had all these promises intended for this nation. So remember, after the flood, people again fell away from God. They began to seek for explanations for the source of life. A lot of what we see today, so many people, are just looking. They're looking for something to satisfy them. They're trying so many different things to try to find God, and nothing is satisfying them. And so people begin to experiment with things, and they began worshiping again the powers of nature, the sun, the moon, the stars, the rain, fire, animals. And then gradually these images of these gods emerged, and they became more real. They started making them out of stone and wood and erecting these big towers and these big, Ephesus and these places of worship. And because sex was the means of life and reproducing of life, they began to make these perverted images of sexual acts. They drew depictions of their gods and their goddesses, and their heathen worship became their life and their religion. But God saw something in Abram. He trusted him. He trusted him to remain separate and apart from what everybody else was doing. He knew that Abraham would do it. But listen, even Abram's own father, his father was named Terah. He was an idol maker by trade. So Abram and his descendants were commanded to separate from idol worship and from wickedness and come to a land where he would give to his descendants forever. So then we enter into this time of the patriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were given this title of patriarchs. So Abraham was the spiritual head of the family, of this patriarchal family. God loved Abraham so much that, he loved him so much that he devoted 14 chapters just on this man, Abraham. Abraham's call was a personal summons for separation. And in this world of idolatry, God called him to separate himself from all of that. And so Abraham had to teach his family, who in turn would teach their families about the only one and true God. So just as Abraham was told to leave his country and his family and to separate, the Bible also tells us as believers that we also need to separate. There needs to be a biblical separation. It is the recognition that God has called us as believers to come out of the world, to have a personal devotion of purity in the midst of this culture. We live in a sinful culture, and people want to follow the society. Society wants to dictate to us, what to buy, how to dress, where to go, and we just follow the society, and God does not want us to follow the traditions of what society tells us that we need to follow. So it means that we need to commit ourselves to live a godly standard of behavior. So in other words, we are to live in the world, my friends, but we're not to be a part of it. That's the difference. God is calling you and me to separate ourselves from the world. Okay? So now let's get back and talk about the Hebrew word covenant. It comes from the verb signifying to cut or divide. This was the custom of making an incision where blood flows. And you all know that for ages, primitive people have always practiced this rite. Peoples of different parts of the world, of ages, they would bind together and make these agreements. They would make it's called like the blood brothers. Okay, so this is where the term blood brothers come in, is that these men would enter into a covenant. They would cut each other either in the arm or the wrist, and they would mingle their blood together. And so a blood covenant was so sacred that it would bind them together, it would bind their families into these covenants. And so this was very common in back in those days. But to cut a covenant with the Lord God was unprecedented. No one had ever done that before. So, because of their covenant between Abraham and God, it was such a strong friendship, that covenant that they made together. Abraham is the only person in the Old Testament called the friend of God. If you read in 2 Chronicles 20 and 7, he talks about how he is the friend of God. Isaiah mentions how Abraham and God were friends. Even James, in the book of James, talks about how Abraham and God had this really binding friendship. So as Abram enters into this covenant with God, his name gets changed. All right. So he goes from Abram to Abraham. Abram meant high exalted father, but now he's a father of many, meaning a father of many nations. And his wife Sarai now became Sarah, which means a princess. So Abraham then pledges his very life to God. And God gives him these promises and these blessings. He blesses him financially and physically and spiritually. And his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan for an everlasting covenant. His future descendants, the Bible said, would be like the sands in the sea and like the stars in the heavens. And through his posterity, that means that through his descendants would come the seed of Jesus Christ, where all the families of the earth now would be blessed. And he would have an abundant financial blessing as well. So the covenant between God and Abraham was mutual. This was the vow to Abraham. God said, "By myself I have sworn to be your partner." So now we understand why every time we read in the Bible, I mean, it's helped me to understand it, that whenever I read it, it says, "I am the Lord who keepeth covenants." So now I understand that, God was saying he keeps his commandment, his covenants, he keeps his word to man. Okay? He says, "I am the Lord who keeps covenants." So I'm mentioning this so much because it's vital and it's really important, and it's so significant to understand that God's covenant with Abraham, and since every believer in Jesus Christ also becomes a covenant partner with him. So I'm going to stop here, and I still have so much to say about this. I get really excited, and I'm sorry I'm like stumbling around with my words, but this is really, really important. And but you're going to understand it more in our next lesson, because in our next lesson I'm going to go into detail about circumcision. What was this covenant of circumcision, and what does it mean to us today? So you don't want to miss our next lesson. It's vital, it's important, it's beautiful. And so we're going to end in this, and in a couple more days I'll get the next lesson prepared, and I'll try not to get so excited so you could understand me better. But I want to thank you again for taking the time to listen. And you don't want to miss our next lesson. You don't want to miss it, because you're going to want to be a part of this next covenant. And I want to thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. God bless you, and you'll hear from me in a couple of days. Have a nice day.